This is Yemen, a land of many divisions and contrasts, a place with more than 3,000 years of political history and rich cultural tradition, the home of a unique Islamic sect with its own traditional hierarchy that lasted more than 1,000 years. The sect that I speak of is the Zaydi Madhab of Islam, derived from the traditions and practices of Imam al-Hadi al-Haq Yahya. Zaydism spread throughout the mountains of northern Yemen from before the year 900 CE. From that point on, Zaydi imams would be prevalent in the region, conquering what is known as Greater Yemen in the 17th century. Today, Zaydis remain throughout their old lands, constituting around 40% of the Yemeni population. However, after the North Yemen Civil War, the political institution of Zaydism, the imamate, was abolished. This video will seek to explain how that happened. In 1609, the first British ship visited the then small Yemeni port city of Aden. Although this was just for exploration, British interest in Aden would only increase in the following centuries until the East India Company settled and annexed the town in 1839. When the Suez Canal was inaugurated 30 years later, trade in the region exploded, and the British sought to establish themselves in the Red Sea and contain the Ottoman Empire. This resulted in the expansion of British control in South Yemen until they agreed with the Ottomans to split the country into two spheres of influence. Since the mid-1500s, the Imamate had been in intermittent conflict with the Ottomans, who encroached upon its territory decade by decade and threatened its very existence. Zaydi Muslims resented Turkish authority, seeing Turks as false Muslims. During the turn of the 20th century, the powerful Zaydi clergy and tribes rebelled, leading to peace and an Ottoman Zaydi condominium over much of Yemen. After World War I, the Ottomans were forced to leave, and the Zaydi leader Imam Yahya was the last man standing in the north. He immediately seized the opportunity to conquer South Yemen and the lands of Najran and Asir to the north, only to be crushed by the British Empire and Saudi Kingdom. Although Yahya never nominally gave up his claims to all of Greater Yemen, he increasingly looked inward, seeking to create a more traditional Arab kingdom rather than an orthodox imamate. Yahya originally governed in what many saw as an archaic fashion. His secretaries sat on the floor instead of using desks, ministries created by the imam were swarming with corruption, and Yahya concerned himself with even the smallest minutiae of policy. Road construction, minor tribal disputes, and almost everything down to how many inkwells a new school should have could not go through without Yahya's approval. All the way up to the 1920s, anyone in the imamate could petition Yahya directly. Although minor reforms occurred into the mid-1900s, some Yemenis, increasingly influenced by outside ideas, sought a new form of government. At the time, southern Yemen had several international connections. Aden, the capital of British Yemen, was a crucial port for ships coming through the Suez Canal, and likewise had a diverse population with expatriates in major Arab cities like Cairo and Baghdad. Hadramis depended on their connections with relatives in Southeast Asia and the rest of the Arab world. With these connections came new ideologies: Islamism, progressivism, and pan-Arabism. Yahya's failure to modernize ultimately led members of the Hadrami al-Waziri family, supported by the Muslim Brotherhood and prominent reformists, to attempt a coup in 1948, a coup that failed miserably. Yahya was killed and a constitutional monarchy was temporarily established, but Yahya's son Ahmad quickly ended the plot, declared himself the new imam, and executed many of its conspirators. However, seeing the consequences of Yahya's failed reform, Imam Ahmad decided to release some of the coup leaders, who subsequently praised him and supported his son al-Badr Muhammad. Although Ahmad tried to push through further reform by centralizing the petition system, ending slavery, and developing economic projects, this was only slightly successful because of the imam's constant involvement in every little matter of society, just like under Yahya. It definitely didn't help that Ahmad himself was a major morphine addict who was often unreachable for days or weeks because of his visions. He allied North Yemen with Gamal Abd al-Nasser's United Arab Republic when it was formed in 1958, not because he was fond of Pan-Arabism, but because they both hated the British. However, resenting al-Nasser's increased influence in the kingdom, Ahmad cut ties with the UAR in 1961, leading al-Nasser to bring together a conspiracy against the Imam. When Ahmad finally died the next year, his son al-Badr Muhammad was supposed to succeed him, but the Yemeni Free Officers, supported by al-Nasser, took over the capital, declared the Yemen Arab Republic, and forced al-Badr into exile. Despite being known as an incompetent alcoholic, al-Badr was not going to give up the throne so easily, so he rallied loyal tribesmen and officials against the new Free Officers regime, beginning the North Yemen Civil War. Now, you might think that the Free Officers were noble people fighting for a free Yemen. While that may have been the case, al-Nasser poured thousands of soldiers into the YAR, effectively rendering it a satellite state of Cairo. The new leader of Yemen, Abdullah Salal, was hardly even from the country and spent more time in Egypt than in Yemen. These developments quickly alienated local reformist leaders, although much of the population still liked Salal due to radio propaganda and resentment of the imamate. However, the YAR army rapidly collapsed at the start of the war, and fresh conscripts, initially excited to serve, deserted constantly as the war dragged on. On the other hand was the royalist side, really an amalgamation of northern tribes, imamic loyalists, and liberals disillusioned with the republic's leadership. Often, clan and tribal disputes were reframed as royalist versus republican without any attention to ideology. The war ultimately became a proxy conflict between the Arab monarchies, especially Saudi Arabia, and the UAR, dragging on until 1970. At the onset of the war, the Republicans only controlled the capital city, Sana'a, but they slowly advanced in all directions. They were halted in the far north of Yemen with its hostile Zaidi tribes, but captured the western coastal plain and much of lower Yemen, with more friendly Sunni populations. However, by 1965, the war had become a stalemate, quickly depriving Egypt and Saudi Arabia of cash. In 1967, Israel captured the Sinai Peninsula, immediately threatening al-Nasser's position in Yemen. All Egyptian troops, now numbering more than 100,000, were withdrawn to fight the Israelis. Salal, who had now fallen out of grace with the UAR and his own people, was overthrown unopposed while living in Baghdad, leaving Abdurrahman Iryani as president of the Republic. The sudden withdrawal of Egyptian troops had left his army in shambles, and now an army of more than 50,000 royalists besieged Sana'a. Although Iryani fled, Prime Minister Hassan al-Amiri saved the Republic by rallying locals and routing the monarchists, effectively ending the war since the Egyptians and Saudis had made peace and the monarchists were no longer receiving new weapons. Finally, in 1970, the two sides signed an armistice. Most monarchists returned to their initial positions before the war and became part of the Republic's state framework, so in the end, not very much changed politically. However, the imamate, an institution that had lasted almost 1,100 years, was abolished. Yemen, now split into a Republican North and Socialist South, would thus remain divided until 1990. The North Yemen Civil War was important for a variety of reasons. Besides the destruction of the imamate, it marked a crucial turning point for Pan-Arabism, as Gamal Abdel Nasser was ultimately unable to control Yemen as he wished. Without a Zaidi imam in Yemen, Saudi Arabia was more free to influence the country, seeking to spread Wahhabism and sideline Shi'as. This led the Houthi and jihadist movements to gain traction further down the line, causing, or at least contributing to, the massive civil war that continues in Yemen to this very day. Furthermore, ideological differences between the North and South prevented true unification, and distinct southern and northern identities formed, fueling the idea of separatism. And finally, the lack of a distinct ideology and continued political stagnation of North Yemen would bring about the flawed political structures in the country that caused its collapse during the Arab Spring.